Hello.
Hello, hello, hello. We
Nice to
are
see you.
live.
We did it.
We did it. I don't know why. Every day this week it's been a surprise. Woohoo!
In all fairness, I had a mild panic attack. I'm like, did I click the right button? But I
You
got here.
did. You're here. You're here. Hello, everybody joining. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. B, I know it's kind of end of your day for you. So,
Yes.
what time is it there right now?
It's 5:30,
Right.
but based on what the sun is doing, it might as well be 9 p.m.
Oh, it's super dark.
Yes, can you see my lovely, what they call a sad lamp?
Oh
To
no.
counteract my energy dropping, I have
Uh,
this gorgeous lamp. It's actually a really good gift. I got one for my sister as well, hoping
and you
while her
you
remote
find it
working.
works?
I do. I do. It's a different tone to some of the other lights. So it mimics the sun rays.
There's nothing like some good sun rays.
Exactly.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. Welcome. Well, we are here at the end of the week, the culmination of this four-part series, and I couldn't think of a better way to close us out than with you, Bianca. Thank you, everybody who's joined us. Earlier in the week, we started the International Women's Day series, Break the Bias series, with Lizelle Festejo Sue and Ashley Ford from Great Place to Work, talking about belonging. And then on Tuesday, we chatted with Kurt Johnson from Four Moon, all around inclusion and representation. And yesterday had an amazing conversation with Vanessa Brangman from Achievers about achievement, who you know her really well, Bianca, obviously
I
working
do.
together. And today we are talking all about support as it relates to International Women's Day, week, ongoing initiatives, breaking the bias. And I'm so happy to have you here. Thank you so much for joining.
I'm
And
so
I would
happy to
love
be
it.
here.
Yeah. And I would love it if you could introduce yourself and your role at Achievers to our audience.
Absolutely. So I lead a team of amazing people who implement our software. So that's across technical consultants, implementation managers, customer support specialists, and it's really a great part of the customer journey. We get to start with concept and bring them all the way to launch and then post-launch. And it's about uncovering what transformation looks like for our customers. I am from Canada originally, but I moved out to the UK in 2018 to build our professional services team here that services our EMEA clientele. I like to say that I dragged my husband across the pond, but we've been enjoying it, and we've been trying to enjoy London again since it's been reopening.
Yeah, do you feel like it's kind of open or sort of back to normal there, or what's it feel like?
It's getting there. Like we have the ability to sort of move through London as though the pandemic is over, but we are cautiously sort of experiencing that. That's the best way for me to say
Yes.
it.
Cautiously optimistic, right?
Exactly,
Uh,
exactly.
Amazing. Well, I know we have a lot to talk about today, and we're trying to keep these. It's been great this week. We've had so much to talk about with everybody. So why don't we jump in?
Absolutely.
I know the first thing I would love to hear from your perspective. We're talking all about support as it relates to breaking the bias and International
Yes,
Women's Day, but I would love to hear what support means to you in this context.
absolutely. Um, so my work through employee resource groups, so when I was chairing the Women's Network up until last year, and now moving into the DEI committee and our ERG Alliance, which is a customer community that brings ERG leaders together. I've seen, and I really, really believe that it's fostering communities where support can actually thrive. So
Mm.
that's refining it, cultivating it, making sure it's easily accessible, and having different forms of it. So when it's needed, it can be tapped into, um, and really leveraged to allow people to evolve and to move through difficult situations. Practically for me, support in the ERGs was about hearing the word yes sometimes when I was expecting to hear the word no. I remember our CEO at the time, when I stepped into the chair of the Women's Network role in 2016, I went to him with what I thought was a grand plan. And he was incredibly supportive. He was pretty much giving me, he was up for the challenge. If I could actually deliver on my ambitious plan, he was there to support me. And I found the same experience with our dear Vanessa, as she was, an executive sponsor for AWN when I was working with them, and now also with our new sponsor through the DEI committee.
Amazing. And I would love if you can share more about like AWN as the Achievers Women's Network,
Yes.
and how that kind of came to be. And ERG was like the first, actually, when you and I, Vanessa, were talking, it was the first time I'd ever heard that terminology before.
Yes.
So I'd love to, maybe you can connect the dots, and in the context of the Achievers Women's Network, talk a little bit more about what that is, how it got started, and give our audience a little more context.
Absolutely. So I think what's important, especially with International Women's Day being the reason that we're together, is that the Women's Network was really created to allow the women working at Achievers a space to learn from each other, to have access to tools and experiences that wouldn't be as easily accessible if that community didn't exist, or it wouldn't be as obvious to those who didn't know where to go to find it. Now, as far as how AWN, or the Achievers Women's Network, came to be, an employee resource group really is a grassroots initiative that is led and driven by employees. And one of the things that I think is important to say about the Women's Network when I stepped into it is that I selfishly wanted to be held accountable for some of the audacious goals that I had put forward for myself. But it turned into one of the richest experiences that, I have had in my career, and I continue to look to recreate that. I think further to that, really, it's about being able to find the tools to maintain your authenticity while you're working towards your professional goals. So what the programming that was created through the Women's Network was in pursuit of that, and then people became attracted to that intention for the same reasons or for different reasons. And then it was really an energy exchange of volunteers who were making time. They didn't have time, were making time to learn from each other and to be learners and to carve out space for that community. And then it really just had this ricochet effect where the people were the movement. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that the Women's Network, prior to stepping into it, I think had different perceptions across the business of what the intention of it was. So the original rebranding efforts that we did to ensure that we were very clear and overly communicative of exactly what it is we were setting out to do, so that we could get allies to also join us. You didn't need to necessarily be a woman or identify as a woman to be part of the Women's Network. Some of our greatest volunteers are across many different, identities. And a backbone to that community that was near and dear to my heart was the mentorship program that has now evolved and iterated into its own beautiful thing. But at the time, it was because I remember thinking, like, if I didn't have the personality that I have, would I ever have felt comfortable walking up to X, Y, and Z person and asking them about their story? So I wanted to, create a foundation for that to be easily accessible to anyone who might need it.
And was the mentorship program born out of the Achievers Women Network, or was that kind of running in parallel to the Achievers Women's Network?
It was born out of the Women's Network. I like to say that it was accessible to everyone, administered with love by the Women's Network. My colleague, David Zinni, who is a longstanding Achievers Women's Network member. I remember he and I sitting down and trying to craft what that program looked like. And our goal was to make it as agile as possible. The intention wasn't to be held up in creating something perfect, but to get something out there and get feedback and apply that feedback and keep changing and evolving it and moving it forward. And I must say that it is in the best hands ever. Highly skilled people who are going to bring it to a completely different level now. But it was a passion project, and I think a symbol of one of the things that I can't help myself and do, which is just free fall, not know, and know that it's going to work out.
It's been a common theme this week, this idea of not waiting till something's perfect, right? Just jumping in, seeing how it goes, iterating, learning, moving, progressing. So it's beautiful to hear that. And did the community, did the groups, was it a slow burn, or do you feel like it was like, oh my God, it was unleashed and everybody wanted to be a part of it? How would you describe the momentum?
That's a good question. I think one of the things that set this ERG apart up front was that we had external partners. So I couldn't help myself. We would go to networking events and I would reach out to the people creating them. And I was just like, we need to partner. We need to figure out how to do something together. So we ended up building a community also external to Achievers. So leveraging social media at the time that we did was sort of unusual for internal employee resource groups. But we wanted to democratize what we were learning. You didn't have to be in the walls of Achievers to learn what we were working on. And because of that, I think it maybe adjusts how popular it was because we had Achievers employees who were interested, as well as external members of, at the time, the Toronto community who would participate in some of the events that we did. I also think that there's different initiatives that we ran that spoke to different people. So as an example, mentorship program would work for somebody, but we had a storytelling series, which has evolved and adapted over time to be a digital series now, where we would interview people across the business at different parts of their career, but really look to understand what was behind the scenes. What tools did you need to leverage in order to get to where you were going? That was a really critical piece of everything that we did early on with the Women's Network. And I think that authenticity was what made people gravitate towards it. I would be remiss to give it more clout than that, but I think it was a bit unusual beginning.
Amazing. So anyone who's listening who's like, oh my gosh, this sounds like an amazing initiative, what advice would you give them to start something like this up within their own organization or their own community?
Yep. The advice I would give them is to just start. You know, one of the most interesting things that have happened since the Women's Network is that so many other employee resource groups exist today that are incredibly important, and there are the right people working and leading and driving those. I think any self-doubt that you have, which I think is completely valid, allow it to pass. As my husband says, like a cloud, let it just pass as a thought and move forward. I think also one of the lessons that I'm learning, especially moving into the DEI committee, is that you don't have to boil the ocean. You can start with one thing and do that well and make that your brand and evolve over time. The other important thing for me specifically was knowing what's in it for yourself. When what you're working on actually recharges you, it doesn't feel like work. And that's actually a big part of the community that we fostered. One of the superpowers that I got from my mom is showing other people their superpowers. So it was really important for me to make sure that any volunteer who was working with us was working on things they actually cared about, because those were the things that got completed. If you're working on things that are not aligned to what originally gravitated you towards the resource group or, you know, insert whatever initiative, it's easy for those things to fall off your priority list.
Yeah, passion and purpose, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's a great segue into your new role as chair of the DEI committee.
Yeah,
Maybe you can share with us what you're doing as part of that committee now.
absolutely. So maybe I'll start with what's the same.
Mm-hmm.
One of the interesting things about the Achievers Women's Network and the DEI committee is that they are both a constant dialogue and, initiative and program creation around the dichotomy of authority and power and who's in that seat and who's not represented and what that does to your life in a work environment. So that was my parallel, or not my parallel, my connector between the two.
Right.
What's different about the DEI committee is that AWN for me was intuitive. I didn't really battle myself quite often with what we should do and where we should go, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
Whereas the DEI committee has an underpinning of needing to advocate for what our DEI organizational strategy should be. It is organized intentionally as we restructured it last year to focus on our product, our people, and our message. So it also is a never-ending cycle of one step back, one step forward, or two steps forward, because you're learning. I'm learning, how these departments operate, how their strategy gets created, and how DEI can really be part of it. And that involves tempering some of the things that I would have just dived into with the Women's Network, because it's not about quick wins all the time. It is a fluid strategy. It actually should be, as long as your organization exists, your DEI strategy should be fluid and evolving and responding to your employees. And I also think with the DEI committee, it is about being really comfortable not knowing everything. There's no ego in that work because of my background and my experience. I have my own personal identity and intersectionalities, but different to the Women's Network, where you're focused on a specific thing, even though there's intersectionalities within that. We're really meant to wrap our arms around all of the communities at Achievers that aren't represented. And when you don't know what you don't know, you can want to pace yourself for fear of excluding. So it's really a learning mentality, and it's a constant dialogue and interrogation with yourself, in my opinion, to really make sure that you've asked the right people and you're getting the opinions of folks who are going to be affected by programs you're running, initiatives you're running, strategy you're trying to push. And with the Women's Network, because of when I started it and the role I played, I was on the front lines of the business. So I felt like I was really good at knowing exactly what everybody was feeling. Whereas now I need to consciously, and I enjoy this, which is great, but I need to consciously make sure that I'm having conversations with the subject matter experts, with the people who, identify as this or practice X religion or whatever the case may be. It's beyond my lived experiences is a very short way to say what I was trying to say.
No, there's like so much there. I'm trying to think like where we could go, but I'm sure as part of the committee or as part of these conversations, an important element of that is creating a supportive environment for those conversations, for that discussion. Maybe you can talk us a little bit how you go into those meetings or with the committee or with an ever fluid, changing, obviously, mission and sort of guiding those conversations. I don't know, maybe you can talk about who's on the committee, not necessarily by name, but just give us some more context from like how you create that supportive environment to have those conversations and do the work.
That's a great question. So my first goal was making sure that the people to the left and right of me had different perspectives than I. Diversity of thought is incredibly important.
Right.
And that included letting go of, control of how things evolved and where, they even started in some circumstances. So the way that we're set up is that we have a lead that represents our product, our message, and our people. And within those three pillars, there are additional volunteers who are, because of capacity, can pick things up and run with them. Then we have another subset of volunteers that we tap on and call out to when we need additional support and their capacity allows. And then we just have a focus group element where there are folks who've said, I know I don't have time for whatever the reason may be, but I would like to, be able to provide a point of view or a perspective for some of those quick hit things. So again, I'd be remiss to not share with you that could change. And I think the best part about moving into this new volunteer role is that I really needed to be okay with failing fast. And there's no ego in that because I'm learning. And I think that authenticity, that vulnerability that I try and show up to meetings with is the reason that we can create a supportive environment. And I'm hoping I'm leading by example. We were in a meeting the other day where we could have just gotten into business. And one of the leads started openly sharing how difficult, the times are right now for him. And I didn't even want to add a comment to switch gears. We sort of just paused and accepted that that's the reality. Another team member acknowledged that, that was the only meeting that they've had where there's space for that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it's about making sure that my voice isn't the loudest in those meetings. I want to really try my best to listen as much as possible and amplify the people around me to follow their instincts for the things that they know through and through. Did I answer your question?
You did. and I love that about creating space, right? Because so often in our day-to-day, it's all about the next and get to it and we forget about creating that breathing room to feel what we're feeling and be vulnerable with one another, or feeling like we have to be perfect, So
absolutely,
the more we evolve and understand one another, having those moments are so important, I think. And I'm sure the work gets done and you get to the business at some point.
Absolutely.
But that's such a beautiful opportunity to create that space for one another.
Yeah. And you just said something that reminded me of like that storytelling aspect of the Women's Network that I adore so much. We're definitely trying to bring that into the DEI committee. And actually one of the events, I think Vanessa might have spoken to this, but one of the events that we started through the Women's Network, but that was in partnership with the DEI committee, was Only One in the Room, which is an annual event, initially was had in 2020, and we've done it every year since. And it's about exactly what you just said, creating the space for people to understand what the different lived experiences are like. And I know from my point of view, through the murder of George Floyd and the BLM movement, work was quite challenging. I showed up, code switched or switched gears, as you do, compartmentalize, I think is what everyone's doing. But I was really seeking acknowledgement that what could be going on in the world could affect me. So I think as leaders, when it comes to support, whether it's through ERGs or whether it's through your team that you're leading, I think asking yourself, how can I make sure that I'm creating space for people to talk about issues? How can, I be the one leading by example in that realm? can really allow people to show up as their whole selves and feel like, you care, which I
Be
think
able to
brings
bring their whole self.
humanity
Their
into
whole
the
self.
room.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, we can talk on that topic for much longer, but I wanted to
Yep.
also make sure we talk a little bit about, obviously, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. This idea about achieving equity, which is ongoing work and will be infinitely ongoing work, I feel like.
Yeah.
But what do you think, how can people show up as allies or, learn more about allyship when it comes to achieving equity, be more supportive?
Yes. I think curiosity is incredibly important. Analyzing where you are on your allyship spectrum is critical. And I humbly say that when I was focused on the identity that I stood in, I felt like I understood allyship. When you're tasked with broadening your perspective, I've realized that my allyship seat and where I sit in that spectrum shifts and changes based on the culture or community that I'm understanding. So I think that is a humble exercise, and I welcome everybody to do it. My husband and I went to go watch the new Batman. Highly recommend.
Okay.
But there was there's a point to that story. So there was a really good ad of all things, but it's in your field, so I hope you'll appreciate this.
Yeah.
And it was a Google ad for just Google search in the UK for those who want to Google it. But it was about how there's no dumb questions and how Google search engine creates a safe space, to ask questions about diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's a lot of fear in showing up wrong, and I want to do my best to dispel that. And I think the only way that I can is by getting it wrong sometimes and iterating on it and being focused on learning. So again, to bring back to your question on like allyship and what people can do and support, be curious, ask great questions. There's really not a dumb question. Some should be reserved for a private Google search, but I will say that it's what you do with the answers that are the most critical when it comes to allyship. The other thing I want to mention is that I sometimes juggle with the amount of time that I or volunteers invest in this work. And I want to encourage anyone who considers themselves to be an ally to invest their own time as well. I think that there is everyday activism that can be done. It doesn't necessarily need to be formalized through an employee resource group, but it is through actionable things. It's not just what you're thinking. People need to see you show up as an ally. So I recommend that as well for anyone who's looking to lead with a supportive, action-oriented, visible allyship.
Right. And I'll reference something you said earlier. I think it's not about boiling the ocean, right?
Absolutely.
It's about taking on something. Something is better than nothing, and doing the work and progress, right? Progress over perfection.
Yeah, and I appreciate that we're getting to time, but even in my day job, as I like to say, I really aim to have a diverse team with diverse thought across different spectrums. So even if there's any leaders listening to the call, talk to your HR business partners, figure out how you can do that in a way that's comfortable for you. At the very least, interrogating your own biases when it comes to hiring. That's in your control. That's the other thing I actually wanted to mention about the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, different to AWN, is that quite a few variables outside of my control, but it's again about amplification and support. So, yeah.
Well, you are a superhero to me, and you, have achieved so much over your time in Achievers and in this role and as part of AWN and now DEI. And I'm really so grateful for our conversation today and for your time. And I look forward to learning more from one another and hopefully continuing this conversation in the future. I think everyone this week is like, oh, we might have to do more of these or part twos or something because there's so much
Yes.
more to talk about. But I really appreciate your time, Bianca, and thank you so much for being part of this community. And happy International Women's Day week ongoing.
Yes, year. It's an
Year.
everyday practice.
Exactly.
Yes. Thank you for having me.
And take care of yourself. We'll see you soon.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye, everybody.